He's a complete failure. His little tech startup will never amount to anything. My name is Lucas Brennan. I am 32 years old, and I run a data analytics company called Skyloom Analytics out of a cramped apartment in Austin, Texas. What bothers me is not the skepticism itself, but the certainty behind it. People who have never written a line of code, never built anything from scratch, somehow know exactly why my work will fail. Edward Calloway had been explaining my inevitable downfall to anyone who would listen for 3 years running. Tonight, at Thanksgiving dinner with both our families packed around his mahogany dining table, he was doing it again. I had stepped into the kitchen to grab another bottle of wine when his voice carried through the doorway. Emily deserves better than this. 3 years of watching him play computer games in their living room. I stood there holding the wine bottle, listening to my father-in-law educate the room about my character defects. The kitchen was warm from the oven, and I could hear my mother-in-law agreeing with him in soft, sympathetic tones. My own parents were probably sitting there saying nothing, which was somehow worse than arguing. Edward continued his assessment. The man has no sense of practical responsibility, no steady income, no benefits, no plan for the future. Just this fantasy about making money from software. I walked back into the dining room, poured wine for everyone who wanted it, and smiled at Edward like I had heard nothing at all. But something had shifted in my chest, something cold and patient. The truth was I had signed acquisition papers with Vertex Holdings 2 days earlier. $12 million for Skyloom Analytics, plus an executive position with their data infrastructure division. The announcement would go public on Monday, 3 days from now. But sitting at Edward's table, watching him explain why I was destined for failure, I decided that some people deserved to learn about success the hard way. Emily caught my eye across the table. She knew something was different, but she did not know what. I had not told her about the acquisition yet. I wanted everything finalized before I shared the news, wanted to be absolutely certain before I got her hopes up. Now I had a different reason for keeping quiet. I wanted Edward to have a few more days of certainty about my worthlessness. I wanted him to go to sleep tonight confident that he understood exactly what kind of man his daughter had married. The rest of dinner passed normally. Edward talked about his real estate investments and his plans for expanding his property management business. My cousin asked about my computer hobby, and I gave vague answers about client work and revenue growth. Nothing specific enough to sound like bragging. Nothing detailed enough to be impressive. When we left that night, Edward shook my hand and wished me luck with my little project. His tone was patronizing but not unkind. He probably thought he was being supportive. I met Emily 4 years ago at a coffee shop near the University of Texas campus. She was finishing her master's degree in education, and I was working as a freelance developer while planning my exit from a corporate software job that was slowly killing my creativity. We talked about books and technology and what it meant to build something meaningful with your life. Emily believed in taking risks for the right reasons. Her family believed in security above everything else. Edward had built his wealth through careful real estate investments and conservative business decisions. He owned rental properties across Austin and prided himself on never making a move that could not be easily explained to a banker. When Emily and I got married 2 years ago, Edward had pulled me aside at the reception to discuss my long-term strategy. I explained that I wanted to build a company that could help small businesses make sense of their data, create analytics tools that were powerful but accessible. He nodded politely and suggested I consider applying for management positions at established tech companies. Skyloom Analytics started in our apartment 6 months after the wedding. The idea was straightforward. Most small businesses collected enormous amounts of data, but had no way to analyze it effectively. Enterprise solutions were too expensive and complicated. Basic tools were too limited. We could build something in between, something that gave small companies the insights they needed without requiring a dedicated IT department. The first year was promising. I landed 3 clients through networking and word-of-mouth referrals. Emily taught high school while I worked nights and weekends building the platform. Edward would ask about my progress at family dinners, but his questions always focused on when I planned to start looking for a real job. The second year was harder. One client canceled their contract due to budget cuts. Another decided to handle their analytics internally. I spent months pitching to prospects who liked the demo, but could not commit to the monthly fees. Edward started mentioning job openings at companies where he had connections, casual suggestions that felt more like interventions. This year had been different. 6 months ago, a mid-sized consulting firm started using our platform for their client reporting. They loved the results and recommended us to other companies in their network. By September, we had 12 active clients and a waiting list. The revenue was finally consistent enough to pay Emily and me actual salaries. That was when Vertex Holdings reached out. They had been watching the small business analytics space and were impressed with our client retention rates and product reviews. They wanted to acquire Skyloom Analytics and integrate our technology into their enterprise solutions. The initial conversations were exploratory, but by October, we were discussing specific terms. Last Tuesday, I signed the final paperwork. $12 million for the company, plus a 2-year consulting contract and equity in their expanded analytics division. Everything I had worked for, everything Edward said would never happen. But he did not know that yet. The phone call from Vertex Holdings came on Monday morning while I was reviewing our client onboarding process. Emily had left for work an hour earlier, and the apartment felt unusually quiet. I had been expecting this call for a week, but I still felt unprepared when David Chen from their acquisitions team confirmed that everything was finalized. "The press release will go out at 9 a.m. Eastern," David said. "We are excited to announce the acquisition of Skyloom Analytics and welcome you to the Vertex Holdings family." After I hung up, I sat in my home office for 20 minutes without moving. 3 years of work, 3 years of Edward's polite skepticism, 3 years of wondering if I was being naive about what I could accomplish. The validation felt enormous, but also strangely distant, like I was watching someone else's success story unfold. I called Emily at school and asked if she could meet me for lunch. She said she had a planning period at noon and could drive over to meet me at the diner near our apartment. I did not tell her what the call was about, just that I had news to share. An hour later, we were sitting in a booth near the window, and I was explaining how our lives had just changed completely. Emily cried, which surprised me because she rarely cried about anything. But I realized that she had been carrying more stress about our financial situation than she had let on. "I always believed in what you were building," she said, "but I worried sometimes about the pressure you put on yourself." "I worried about it too," I admitted, "especially after family dinners with your dad." Emily's expression changed. "He has been hard on you, I know that, but he means well, even when he does not express it well. He called me a complete failure, Emily. 3 days ago at Thanksgiving, I heard him telling everyone that my startup would never amount to anything, and that you deserved better." She stared at me. "He said that?" "I went to get wine from the kitchen and he was explaining to your mother and your sister why I was not good enough for you. He was not trying to be quiet about it." Emily looked hurt, not just for me, but for herself. I had no idea he was saying things like that. "It does not matter now," I said, though we both knew it did matter. "But I want you to understand why I might not be eager to call him with the good news." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe we let him find out when everyone else finds out. When the press release hits the business news and people start calling to congratulate us. I do not need to prove anything to your father, but I also do not need to make his reaction easier for him." Emily considered this carefully. "I understand. How long do you want to wait?" "Until he calls us," I said. "Let him sit with it." The press release went live at 9 a.m. Eastern on Monday morning. By 10 a.m., my phone was buzzing with notifications from LinkedIn, Twitter, and local business news sites. The headline was straightforward: Austin-based Skyloom Analytics acquired by Vertex Holdings for $12 million. I watched the story spread across social media throughout the morning. Former colleagues shared the article with congratulatory comments. College friends sent messages asking if the Lucas Brennan in the headline was the same person they remembered from computer science classes. Local tech groups posted about Austin's growing startup ecosystem and how our acquisition demonstrated the city's potential for innovation. Emily texted me from school. "My principal just showed me the article online. She wants to know if she can interview you for the school newsletter." By noon, I had received 43 phone calls, 67 text messages, and more LinkedIn connection requests than I could count. Everyone wanted to congratulate me, catch up over coffee, or discuss potential collaboration opportunities. The attention was overwhelming, but also gratifying in ways I had not expected. What was missing was any communication from Edward Calloway. I knew he had seen the news. Emily's sister Claire had called Emily during her lunch break to ask if the acquisition story was real. Emily's mother had left a voicemail saying how proud she was and how excited the whole family felt about our success. But Edward remained conspicuously silent. Tuesday came and went without a word from my father-in-law. Wednesday afternoon, Emily mentioned that her mother had asked why Edward had not called to congratulate us yet. Emily did not have a good answer, because we both knew exactly why he was struggling to find the right words. Thursday evening, Edward finally called. I was working late in my home office, responding to emails from potential clients who had learned about Skyloom Analytics through the acquisition coverage. When his name appeared on my phone screen, I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later, then again before I went to bed. Each time I watched his name appear and disappear without answering. Friday morning he tried texting. "Lucas, I have been trying to reach you. Could we talk when you have a chance?" I showed the message to Emily over breakfast. She looked conflicted, like she understood my position but felt torn between her husband and her father. "He is probably embarrassed," she said, "about what he said on Thanksgiving." "Good," I replied. "He should be embarrassed. He is still my father, Lucas. At some point you will need to have a conversation with him." "At some point, yes, but not right now. Not while he is scrambling to figure out how to rewrite the last 3 years of dismissing everything I worked for." Emily nodded, but I could see that my unwillingness to take Edward's calls was creating tension for her. She was caught between supporting her husband and maintaining peace with her family. It was an unfair position, and I realized I would need to resolve this situation soon. But first, I wanted Edward to understand what it felt like to be ignored by someone whose opinion mattered to him. For 3 years, he had treated my work like a hobby and my ambitions like delusions. He had never asked serious questions about my business model or my client base. He had simply assumed that anything I built would fail because I was not the kind of person who built successful companies. Now he knew he had been wrong, and he was desperate to fix his relationship with me before the wrongness became permanent. But rushing to absolve his guilt felt like letting him off too easily. Some mistakes deserved to be uncomfortable for a while. Saturday afternoon, Edward showed up at our apartment unannounced. The knock came at 2 p.m. while Emily and I were planning our weekend. She answered the door, and I heard Edward's voice asking if he could come in to talk with both of us. Emily looked at me questioningly, and I nodded. Avoiding him indefinitely was not sustainable, and having this conversation at our place felt better than meeting on his territory. Edward looked older than I remembered, more uncertain. He sat on our couch and stared at his hands for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you both an apology," he began. "Lucas, I have been trying to reach you since Monday, and I understand why you have not returned my calls. I said things about you and your work that were not only wrong, but cruel." It was a decent opening, more direct than I had expected, but I waited to see where he would take it. When I saw the news about the acquisition, my first feeling was not pride or excitement. It was shame. Shame that I had been so wrong about what you were building, and shame that I'd been so dismissive of your efforts. Edward looked at Emily, then back at me. "Your mother told me that you heard what I said on Thanksgiving, about being a failure, about Emily deserving better. Those words were unforgivable, and I have been thinking about them all week." "They were unforgivable," I agreed. "But they were also honest. That is really what you thought about me." Edward flinched. "Yes, that is what I thought. I was wrong, obviously, but I was also wrong in a deeper way. I let my own fear about financial security make me cruel to someone my daughter loves." "Your fear?" I asked. "I built my wealth through careful, conservative investments. Real estate, municipal bonds, businesses with predictable cash flows. I understand that world, and I know how to evaluate risk in that context. But I do not understand technology, and I do not understand startups. so I assumed they were inherently more dangerous than they actually are. It was an interesting explanation, but it felt incomplete. You were not just skeptical about my business model, I said. You were dismissive of me as a person. You talked about Emily deserving better, not Emily deserving a more stable financial situation. Edward nodded slowly. You are right. I confused my anxiety about your career with my assessment of your character. I decided that someone who made risky professional choices must be irresponsible in other ways too. That was unfair and stupid. Emily had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Dad, I appreciate that you're trying to make amends, but Lucas has every right to be angry about this. You spent 3 years treating him like he was not good enough for me. I know, Edward said. And I know that apologizing now, after he has proven me wrong so dramatically, probably seems convenient. Like I am only changing my opinion because of the money. That is exactly what it seems like, I said. Edward was quiet for a minute. Then he said, What would you need from me to believe that my apology is genuine? It was a fair question, and I thought about it seriously. The truth was, I did not need Edward's approval or even his respect. His opinion of me had been wrong for 3 years, and it would probably be wrong in different ways going forward. But I needed him to understand that his dismissal had been personal, not just professional. I would need you to understand that you were not just wrong about Skyloom Analytics, I said. You were wrong about who I am and what I am capable of, and I would need you to treat Emily's judgment with more respect going forward. Edward thought about what I had said for a long time. Finally, he said, You are absolutely right. I disrespected both of you, and I did it consistently for 3 years. I do not have a good excuse for that. The conversation continued for another hour. Edward asked genuine questions about how I had built Skyloom Analytics, about the technology behind our platform, and about my plans for working with Vertex Holdings. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed actually curious about my work, rather than just politely tolerant of it. I realize now that I never really tried to understand what you were building, he said. I made assumptions based on my own limitations, not based on what you were actually accomplishing. It was true, and it was probably the closest thing to a real apology I was going to get. Edward was not a man who admitted mistakes easily, and this conversation had clearly been difficult for him. When he left that afternoon, Emily and I talked about what came next. The immediate crisis had passed, but our relationship with her family would need time to normalize. Edward had spent 3 years positioning himself as the practical voice of reason, in contrast to my unrealistic ambitions. Now that dynamic was reversed, and everyone would need to adjust. I think he learned something important today, Emily said. Not just about being wrong, but about making assumptions based on limited information. Maybe, I said, but I am not going to pretend that everything is fine now just because he apologized. Trust takes time to rebuild. Emily nodded. I do not expect you to pretend anything. I just hope you can both move forward from this. Over the next few weeks, Edward called regularly but not excessively. He left voicemails about family gatherings and asked thoughtful questions about my transition to Vertex Holdings. His tone was different now, more respectful but also more careful, like he was trying to rebuild a relationship he had damaged. I returned his calls when I felt like it and ignored them when I did not out of spite but because I was busy with the acquisition transition, and because I did not feel obligated to make his guilt easier to manage. He had spent 3 years treating me like my time and work were not valuable. A few weeks of uncertainty about my availability seemed like appropriate consequences. The real test came at Christmas dinner, 6 weeks after the acquisition announcement. Edward had asked if we would be comfortable hosting the family gathering at his house, given everything that had happened. Emily and I agreed, partly because avoiding family gatherings was not sustainable, and partly because I was curious to see how he would handle our first extended interaction since our conversation at the apartment. Edward was gracious without being overly deferential. He asked about my work at Vertex Holdings and listened to my answers like they actually mattered to him. When other family members brought up the acquisition, he expressed genuine pride instead of the careful neutrality I had expected. The most telling moment came when Edward's neighbor stopped by to drop off a Christmas card. Edward introduced me as my son-in-law Lucas, who just sold his analytics company to Vertex Holdings. The introduction was proud, specific, and completely different from how he had talked about me 6 months earlier. After dinner, Edward and I found ourselves alone in his kitchen while Emily helped her mother with dessert. He handed me a beer and said, "I want you to know that I respect what you built. But more than that, I respect how you handled my skepticism. You could have made this whole situation much harder for Emily and for our family." "I considered it," I said honestly. Edward smiled. "I probably deserved worse than I got." "You definitely deserved worse than you got." The real vindication came 6 months later, when Vertex Holdings promoted me to Director of Small Business Analytics and announced that our platform had become their fastest-growing product line. The promotion came with a significant salary increase and equity package, but more importantly, it validated everything I had been trying to build since starting Skyloom Analytics. Edward read about the promotion in the Austin Business Journal and called immediately to congratulate me. His excitement seemed genuine, not forced, like he had genuinely become invested in my success rather than just trying to repair his own reputation. "I have been telling everyone about your promotion," he said. "The guys at the Real Estate Association meeting, my neighbors, even my accountant. I am proud of what you have accomplished." It was a nice sentiment, but I found myself thinking about how different this conversation would have been 3 years earlier. Back then, Edward would not have understood why a promotion at a tech company mattered, or why small business analytics was worth caring about. His pride now felt genuine, but it also felt conditional on external validation that should not have been necessary. "I appreciate that," I said. "Though I should mention that the work itself has not changed much. I am still building software solutions for small businesses, just with more resources and a bigger team. But now you are doing it as a director at a major company," Edward said. "That has to feel different." "It feels good," I admitted, "but mostly because I get to keep working on problems I care about, not because of the title." Edward was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand that now. I used to think that job security and prestigious titles were the most important things, but watching what you built made me realize that finding meaningful work matters more than I thought." It was probably the closest Edward would ever come to admitting that his entire framework for evaluating professional success had been limited. He was learning slowly that there were different ways to build a valuable career. "Emily told me you are thinking about starting another company eventually," he said. "Maybe in a few years," I said, "after I finish my commitment to Vertex Holdings. There are other problems in the small business space that I think technology could solve." "Well, you will have my support this time," Edward said, "and my apologies again for not supporting you the first time." 2 years after the acquisition, Emily and I bought a house in central Austin with a real office where I could work when I was not at the Vertex Holdings headquarters. The house was not extravagant, but it was comfortable in ways our apartment had never been, with space for the life we were building together. Edward and I had developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. He stopped offering career advice and started asking genuine questions about the technology industry. I stopped expecting him to understand my professional choices and started appreciating his willingness to learn from his mistakes. The dynamic at family gatherings changed completely. Instead of deflecting questions about my computer hobby, I found myself explaining emerging trends in data analytics to relatives who were actually interested in the answers. Edward would introduce me to his friends as an expert in small business technology, and his pride felt earned rather than obligatory. Emily was pregnant with our first child, and we had started talking about what kind of values we wanted to pass on. I thought often about the difference between skepticism and support, between asking hard questions and assuming failure. Edward had taught me, accidentally, how important it was to believe in people even when their path did not make immediate sense. On a Sunday afternoon in March, I was working in my home office when Edward called to ask if I wanted to grab coffee and talk about a technology problem he was having with his property management software. It was the first time he had ever asked for my professional advice, and it felt like the completion of a long, complicated process of learning to see each other clearly. "I should have asked for your help years ago," he said when we met at the coffee shop near our house. You were not ready years ago, I said, but you are ready now. We spent an hour discussing database optimization and user interface design, and Edward listened like my opinions actually mattered to him. Not because I had proven myself through external success, but because he had finally learned to value expertise over assumptions. Driving home, I thought about that Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier, about standing in Edward's kitchen and hearing him explain why I was destined to fail. The memory did not make me angry anymore, but it reminded me why earning respect felt more satisfying than demanding it. Some people needed time to recognize what they could not see immediately. And some victories were worth waiting for.